Welcome back to another episode of Flavors and Knowledge. I'm your host, Noah Mitchell, speaking from Chef Walter's Cooking School in Rhode Island, USA. This episode explores the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Colonists protesting British taxation dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, sparking the American Revolution. Tea became a symbol of resistance and taxation without representation. So, let's get started. In the chill December air of 1773, Boston Harbor lay restless under a gray sky, its waters reflecting the tensions that had simmered for years between the American colonies and the distant British crown. The streets of the city pulsed with frustration. For nearly a decade, colonists had chafed under parliamentary taxes imposed without their consent. First the Stamp Act, then the Townshend duties, each one a reminder that they had no voice in the decisions that governed their lives. Taxation without representation had become a rallying cry, whispered in taverns, shouted in town meetings, and printed in broadsides that fluttered through the streets. Tea, that ordinary everyday drink, had become the unlikely flashpoint of a gathering storm. Parliament had passed the Tea Act that spring, a measure designed less to raise revenue than to rescue the struggling British East India Company from financial ruin. The company was granted a monopoly to ship its surplus tea directly to the colonies, bypassing intermediaries and undercutting both legitimate merchants and the thriving trade in smuggled Dutch tea. The price would actually be lower for consumers. However, the principle remained. A tax still had to be paid upon arrival, and accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies at will. In other ports, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, the consignees resigned under pressure and the ships turned back. Boston was different. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, determined to uphold the law, refused to allow the vessels to leave without unloading and paying the duty. The first ship, the Dartmouth, arrived on November 28, carrying 114 chests of East India Company tea from China. Crowds gathered. Meetings filled the Old South Meeting House. Guards from the Sons of Liberty watched the wharves day and night to ensure nothing was landed. Then came the Aliner on December 2, and finally the Beaver on December 15. By the morning of the 16th, 3 ships rode at anchor near Griffin's Wharf, their holds heavy with more than 90,000 pounds of tea, Bohea, Kungu, Souchong, Hyson, and Singlo, worth nearly 10,000 pounds sterling, a fortune in those days. The 20-day legal deadline for the Dartmouth was about to expire. If the duty went unpaid, customs officials could seize the cargo and sell it. That morning, nearly 5,000 people, a third of Boston's population, packed into the Old South Meeting House and spilled into the surrounding streets. Voices rose in debate. Samuel Adams and other leaders pressed for the ships to return to England with their cargo intact. Governor Hutchinson remained unmoved. As darkness fell and the meeting dragged on without resolution, a signal passed among the crowd. War whoops echoed through the hall. Men began slipping away toward the waterfront. Under cover of night, somewhere between 60 and 150 colonists, many of them members of the Sons of Liberty, some disguised in blankets and soot to resemble Mohawk warriors, moved in disciplined groups to the 3 ships. They were not a wild mob. They worked with quiet efficiency, knowing the harbor well, knowing the holds. Axes and tomahawks cracked open the wooden chests. The tea, dense and fragrant, was heaved over the sides. For nearly 3 hours the work continued, methodical and almost silent except for the splash of leaves hitting the water and the occasional order from a commander. Crew members on board offered no resistance. British warships nearby stayed still. When the last chest had been emptied, the men swept the decks clean, thanked the captains for their non-interference, and melted back into the city. By midnight, 342 chests of tea floated on the outgoing tide, or rather, because it was low tide, lay in dark clumps along the mudflats that had to be broken apart again. Boston Harbor smelled of tea for weeks. The next day the city awoke to a transformed shore. John Adams, writing in his diary, called the act so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible that it would have important consequences. Governor Hutchinson condemned it as treason. In London, the news arrived like a thunderclap. King George III declared that the colonies must be mastered or left to themselves. Parliament's response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was rewritten to strip away local self-government. Town meetings were restricted. British troops returned in force. The port that had once thrived with commerce fell silent under the shadow of warships. Yet the punishment that was meant to isolate Boston only bound the colonies more tightly together. Committees of correspondence spread the story south and west. In the summer of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Boycotts were organized. Militias began to drill. Within 18 months, shots would ring out at Lexington and Concord. The tea that had been sacrificed in Boston Harbor had become more than a commodity. It was a symbol of resistance, of principle, of a people who would no longer swallow the bitter draft of taxation without a voice. What began as the quiet destruction of chests under a December moon became the spark that ignited a revolution, and ultimately, a new nation. Ultimately, dear followers, thanks for listening and for the privilege of your time. In conclusion, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us on today's journey through flavor and discovery. You'll find all the relevant links in the show notes, including details on our cooking classes, the full notes and recipes from this episode, and our calendar for culinary tourism tour. Be sure to subscribe to our free newsletter to stay connected and informed. Remember to taste thoughtfully, cook with passion, and continue exploring the boundless world of food. Subscribe for more, share with a fellow food enthusiast, and we'll see you in the next episode. Until then, keep your eyes on the fire and stay curious. The content for this episode is written by Chef Walter and produced by Simval Media, USA.